Da, auzim acum. Bună!
Bună, scuze. Aș fi vrut să te întreb, Mircea, dacă știi ceva despre situația din Mariupol. E o situație foarte dificilă. M-ai auzit? Mircea, bună?
Nu am nimic, scuze.
Nu-mi dau seama dacă mă auzi.
Eu te auzi.
Mircea, ne auzi?
Noi te auzim cu întrerupere.
Ar trebui că sunt la Piața Alba, dacă nici aici n-am semnal.
Acum, cred că îl pierzi, pentru că...
Nu prea ai semnal, Mircea.
Sunt la Piața Alba, că nici aici unde mai este.
Vis-a-vis de Mariupol, nu știu dacă ajută informația sau nu, dar eu am lucrat foarte mulți ani în oțel și am prieteni care lucrează în oțel vreo 10 ani în oțel, în toată lumea și lucrează inclusiv în combinatul de la Mariupol. Și spun că rușii n-au bombardat nimic din industrie. Deci pur și simplu bombardează numai orașul și numai populația civilă ca să-i demotiveze. Combinatul siderurgic e la locul lui liniștit și fără probleme.
Adică exact cum nu se poate mai rău, sau cum se poate mai rău.
Exact cum nu se poate, de industrie au nevoie. Și dacă ocupă.
Corect. Da. Mulțumesc.
Cu plăcere. Acum informația nu este pentru populație, este tot destul de nasoală. Chiar dacă, na.
Înțeleg că nici măcar cu ajutoare nu se poate intra, nu se poate ieși. Da, e groaznic. Asta este.
Da, oamenii care sunt acolo și sunt am un amic care e în legătură directă cu 2 persoane cu care lucra de la combinatul respectiv și una este o doamnă, o mamă cu o fetiță de 2 ani și cu un copil care are 3 luni și ne-a trimis niște fotografii, pur și simplu stau undeva în niște subsoluri, e ca un hol așa, nici nu ai loc să treci, n-au loc unde decât să pună o salteașă atât. Și se încearcă să supraviețuiască până să termină nebunia. N-au altă variantă.
Vă mulțumim, o să vă dau puțin jos de pe scenă, așteptăm să se întoarcă și Mircea, pentru că a intrat și Nick. Și o să continuăm discuția după aceea.
Hello, Nick. We're waiting for Mircea.
Hi, thank you very much. Very pleased to join you. I'm just getting home in the next 5 minutes or so. So, excuse me. If you can just carry on without me for another 5 minutes, I'll literally then be in a quiet place, and then I'll be able to join the discussion.
Absolutely fine.
Fine. I'll microphone off for now then until then.
It's all right, Mircea. Nick will wait for you.
Hello, can you hear me now? I think.
Mircea, Nick a plecat 5 minute, că...
Da. S-a auzit, eu v-am auzit conversație, numai că mă simțeam dent din Adică
Da, din păcate se aude cam prost, Mircea. Te auzim prost.
ce că bun cu uniri. Ar trebui să se audă foarte bine. Pe dreapta
Nu ai semnal, Mircea. Se pare că ești într-o zonă fără semnal și de asta nici nu te auzim foarte bine.
Sunt la Piața Unirii. Dacă zici aici nu este semnal, nu e unde. Ține foarte mult și de faptul că e hotspot făcut. Da, o să intru pe ăla. Oare acum auziți mai bine?
Da, acum te auzi mai bine.
Ce s-a întâmplat era că eram pe celălalt telefon, pe hotspot și n-am apucat încă să-i pun un SIM și, mă rog, a fost o întreagă nebunie astăzi. Dar sper să se audă ok acum. Înțeleg că Nick mai durează 5 minute la el. Haideți să continuăm cu întrebările, să-i dăm drumul și când intră Nick schimbăm în limba engleză. Dacă cineva mai are întrebări, dacă e ceva ce doriți să discutăm, haideți să ne auzim.
Să știți că și secțiunea de întrebări live este deschisă. Deci puteți adresa și acolo întrebările.
Exact, dacă cineva nu vrea să vorbească, puteți să scrieți acolo și unul dintre moderatori va citi întrebările. Și vă rog să profitați de prezența lui Nick, pentru că, din nou, este unul dintre jurnaliștii foarte, foarte experimentați pe tot ce înseamnă conflict. Chiar acum sunt la Unirii și în fața mea e o mașină de Ucraina. Da. Și sunt multe mașini, am mai văzut astăzi multe mașini. Înțeleg de la oameni că și la aeroport, la long-term parking, sunt foarte multe mașini de Ucraina. Și imaginea care mie mi-a trecut așa, mi-a lăsat un gol în stomac, pentru că am văzut-o foarte des în Ucraina săptămâna trecută, în ultimele săptămâni, a fost mașini care au lipite pe parbriz în limba rusă, copii scrie. Și am văzut mașina asta și în București, cu afișul ăla, și așa o imagine a războiului. Știți, vă imaginați de ce probabil pun acele semne în parbriz, cum și noi ne punem semn cu presă. Ca să nu cumva, sau să existe mai puține șanse să tragă cineva în mașină sau să fii lovit, să fii confundat cu mașini, cu soldați sau cu oameni din apărarea civilă. Să vezi așa ceva pe străzile Bucureștiului e o imagine, ca să fiu cât se poate de politicos. În legătură cu deplasarea, eu o să ies mâine, probabil, până în prânz, prin Vama Ungheni. O să merg spre o să traversez Moldova, o să mă opresc un pic la Chișinău, să vorbesc cu colegii, cu Viorica Tătaru și Andrei Captarenco, care s-au întors din Ucraina. Momentan acolo o să plănuim, sau să mai bine să punem pe picioare un proiect a la lung pe care am dorit să-l filmăm în Ucraina. O să vă povestesc mai multe la momentul când el se concretizează cât de cât. Momentan e doar o propunere, doar o discuție pe care o avem cu o televiziune din Marea Britanie pentru un documentar, dar să sperăm că ea se va concretiza în ceva foarte interesant. O să vă spun și subiectul și tot imediat ce aflu mai multe. După care o să ies prin Vama Palanca. Înțeleg, astăzi am avut niște colegi acolo de la BBC pe care nu i-au lăsat să treacă până n-au avut nu știu ce autorizație specială, care cu toții știm ce înseamnă. Cei care nu i-au lăsat se pare că au fost vame și moldoveni. Până la urmă s-a rezolvat, am sunat la poliția de frontieră, am sunat la șeful poliției de frontieră ca să explicăm că nu trebuie nicio autorizație specială să pur și simplu să treci ca jurnalist în Ucraina, că avem toate acreditările, aveau colegii, că eu sunt în România. S-a rezolvat, dar înțeleg că se stă foarte mult la vamă, este o coadă mare, sunt multe filtre de control spre Odessa și cu cât te apropii mai mult, cu atât durează mai mult controlul, deci sper că în 20-26 de ore, deși drumul n-ar trebui să dureze atât, dar eu mi-am estimat cu filtre de control, cam 26 de ore să ajung acolo. După care să mă apuc de treabă, pentru că sunt multe subiecte și la Odessa. Eu am mai fost la Odessa, a fost primul oraș în care am ajuns acum 3 săptămâni, o lună aproape. Venind tot dinspre Moldova, am urmat același traseu. Odessa, pe care eu am găsit-o acum 3 săptămâni, cu oameni voioși pe stradă, care spuneau că nu o să vină niciun război, e complet diferit azi, cum v-a spus și Marius Saizu, la ce oraș să mă aștept. Și v-am mai spus și aici pe Discord, pentru mine e un oraș foarte drag, e unul dintre cele mai frumoase orașe din Ucraina și unul dintre top 5 orașele frumoase pe care eu le-am văzut oriunde am fost. Și m-am întrebat, Nick, este oare...
Hi, Mircea. I am now available to speak.
Hi,
Sorry
Nick.
for the delay. Hi there.
Thank you so much for joining us. Everyone, Nick Thorpe, freelance journalist for the BBC, based in Budapest. I've told the community here, these fine people that are tuning in every night and every day to listen to news about Ukraine, in Romanian mostly. I've told them a little bit about yourself, and I've told them how you came to Eastern Europe and you fell in love literally and decided to stay. I've told them a bit about your coverage of Romania's revolution in 1989, but if you could just tell us a little bit about yourself and how you reported about refugees throughout your career.
Yes, well, that's quite a long story, Mircea. I'm slightly breathless. I've just managed, as we've been connected, to get into my flat here.
Where are you now?
I've just arrived back in my home, which is also my office here in Budapest. I've been living in Hungary for 32 years. You've probably mentioned this, but covering a wide range of countries, including Romania, Bulgaria. Just catching my breath here, actually. Ask a longer question just so I can catch my breath there, Mircea. Sorry, I've got quite steep stairs going up to my flat, which is why I'm momentarily breathless here. Yeah, I mean, talking about refugees, I think the first refugee crisis I covered was probably in 1988, when Romanians, many of them of ethnic Hungarians, but also many simple Romanians, came across into Hungary. There was actually the Formula One race at Magyarul, just on the outskirts of Budapest. It was the first Formula One sports race, and many Romanians arrived, having been allowed out of Ceausescu's Romania, to come to attend that sports event, and the buses had to go back empty because no one wanted to go back. And the Hungarian churches, especially the Protestant churches here in Budapest, were actually putting up, looking after these people, thousands of people just around the churches. And so it was that was my first experience of a refugee situation. After that, in the course of the last 32, 33 years, there have been many more. Of course, the 1989, when I suppose one couldn't call it a refugee situation, but when East Germans were pouring through Hungary on their way out, and that, of course, helped to precipitate the fall of the Berlin Wall and indeed of the whole Iron Curtain. Then already at that time, I was meeting my first Afghan refugees from the Soviet occupation of Afghanistan then. I remember meeting a man, an Afghan in a refugee camp then, who told, when I asked him what he did back in Afghanistan, he was a MiG-29 fighter pilot. Then through the 1990s, I noticed that the graffiti on the walls of Hungarian refugee camps was changing from words written in Farsi or Pashto by the Afghans to words written in Arabic, for example, and then words written in the Cyrillic script, words written in Bosnian or in Croatian, as Hungary, as of course many countries, absorbed a great wave of refugees as Yugoslavia collapsed in the terrible wars in 1991 in Croatia, the terrible war between 92 and 95, which I partly covered for the BBC then, and so on and so forth. I guess before this new refugee crisis, the big one, of course, which we all remember, is the period from 2015, in fact from 2014 through to the present, in a sense of, I hesitate to use the word crisis, but because for the people on the road leaving the Middle East, leaving Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan, even some of those leaving North Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, to be a refugee is to be in crisis. So it was a crisis for people on the road, not necessarily a crisis for those absorbing or meeting the people, for the transit countries like Hungary or Romania, or for the destination countries. Of course, it was a massive challenge for those countries logistically, but it wasn't, I don't think, so much a crisis for them. As I've read and written about refugee issues, I've often come back to a crisis or a situation 100 years ago when 2 to 3 million people fled from the Russian Revolution coming to the West. And then, as now, cities like Paris, London, no doubt Bucharest, Budapest, Vienna at that time were also flooded with large numbers of people coming from the East. And there were those fears then, fears of Jews coming, for example, then, that they might change the ethnic balance, as we saw in 2015, people afraid of Muslims entering Europe, which might change the ethnic balance. And then, of course, leaping forward to the current situation, here we are in 2022, when already we've had almost double the number of refugees coming, as we witnessed 1.3 million back in 2015, and here we are in only the second week, after 2 weeks of after Russia's invasion of Ukraine, with already 2.3 million coming to, 250, already 250,000 in Romania, already 200,000 here in Hungary, already 1.2 million, I think tonight's figure is, in Poland. So, sorry, it was a long answer to a very short question about my experience of waves of refugees in the last 30 years or so. Hi, can you still hear me? Hello, can you still hear me?
Yes, Nick, we can hear you.
Okay, fine. Mircea, do you have a question or someone else?
Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can, yeah.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, well, us journalists, we love long answers and short questions. But I actually want to open the floor pretty quickly to the people tuning in and listening, because I'm sure they have loads of questions for you. I myself had the chance to talk to you in the past, but before I do that, I just have a personal curiosity. You've been on the ground covering the current events. Is there something striking different in something that strikes you as different or unusual or surprising in a positive way?
I would have some observations in a neutral way, which of course, and the obvious difference to all the other refugee movements that I've ever witnessed is that this is really all women and children. And that's quite astonishing to see so many women and children on the move. Of course, that's because men between the age are not allowed out. But apart from a few male students from Ukraine, especially medical students, often from third world countries, from sub-Saharan Africa or the Middle East or India or Pakistan, wherever, it's all women. So that's the single biggest difference. In terms of something positive, it's been marvelous to watch here in my native or my adopted homeland of Hungary, the sheer goodwill levels, really, especially the individuals who are just arriving day after day at border crossings or here in Budapest at the West railway station, simply some of them just with a bag of apples, a bag of shampoo, a box of nappies for the children. So there's that side of it, a very positive one, of a whole country, of a whole society mobilizing to help people that they feel sorry for. And the reason they feel sorry for is, I think, we journalists are doing a pretty good job, which is to report from inside Ukraine, especially the very brave journalists from many countries inside Ukraine today, reporting on the day-to-day horrors of war, of invasion. But also, I think we journalists along the edges of Ukraine are doing a pretty good job to report on the plight of those people, what they need, and the kind of help they're being given. So it is an astonishing outpouring of goodwill, of humanity, in a way, to help people. We saw a lot of that, of course, 7 years ago with the refugee crisis then, but then there were different narratives, especially from governments like that of Hungary, saying that Mr. Orban wanted and indeed rapidly built this razor wire fence to keep people out. So big contrasts then, but even then, many ordinary Hungarians, many ordinary Romanians and other nationalities simply volunteering and going out to help people in their hour of need. So there's parallels, but there are also very big contrasts to the situation 7 years ago.
Thank you for that answer, Nick. I'm going to open the floor now to everyone who's listening, and I'm going to ask the moderators to read out questions. If we have questions on the Ask Questions Live sub-chat. So please, everyone, feel free to ask Nick any question related to what he told us about and his job as a journalist reporting on the ground. Whereabouts have you been, Nick, lately? I know you were at Siret, right? Lately. Is there a story, a particular story or a particular day that you want to share with us in terms of people, what they're saying, where they're going, what sort of things they're leaving behind in terms of family memories?
I should correct you there, Mircea. I haven't made it to Siret yet. I'm hoping to go there next week. Pretty much all my experience in the first 14 days of this awful war has been on the Hungarian-Ukrainian border. There are 5 crossing points there. So far, Hungary has taken in just over 200,000 people a day, basically, perhaps slightly under. The last few days, I've moved from the border to Budapest, and then I've been on the West railway station, where most of the trains from a border crossing point called Záhony, so most of the people are actually reaching the capital on these refugee trains, which arrive every hour or so in Budapest. In terms of stories that I'm hearing, every story is so different. One young woman I met on the border a few days ago at a place called Tisza on the River Tisza. At that point, there's a the border between Hungary and Ukraine is just a bridge over the River Tisa. So people arriving there on foot, being put in minibuses and then taken to what would normally be a very sleepy primary school in a very sleepy village, and which is now they're looking after about 3,000 new arrivals a day there. So one woman I spoke to there, she'd come from Kiev with her 2 children, her 13-year-old daughter and her 8-year-old son. And as they've told me their story, I realized this wasn't just a mother fleeing with her children. It turns out that a few weeks before that, the 8-year-old boy, Nikolai, had been diagnosed with diabetes, very serious diabetes, and he'd been in the intensive care unit of a hospital in Kiev when the war broke out. And so and they spent the first 2 or 3 days of the war in the intensive care unit where he was getting the insulin, the urgent medical treatment that he needed. They then they realized that the hospital couldn't care for them anymore, that it was not a safe place for them to make the journey. So the father of the children, the woman's mother, they managed to cross Ukraine from Kiev to the Hungarian border, where the father, it took them several days dodging the situation, trying to find places to stay, afraid of airstrikes and so on. But when they finally got to the border, obviously the father had to leave them. He wanted to go back and fight for his city. And the woman was basically on this journey injecting her son with insulin. And when I met them just in this primary school in Tisabec in Hungary, there they were being helped by Hungarian volunteers to find the right medical treatment, because it's such an early stage of the illness. They didn't really know yet how to treat it. The analysis, the diagnosis was still very in its early stages. And I've stayed in contact with the woman in the past few days through social media. They're now safely in Austria, in a hospital there. But just this prospect of, there's many other dramatic stories, but theirs is just one of the dramatic stories I've heard in the last week or two.
I just want to add to that I've personally witnessed myself similar stories riding the trains from Mariupol. I was actually on one of the last convoys out of Mariupol before it got besieged. And similar stories you can encounter in every single train station in eastern Ukraine at the moment. And my feeling is that while we see these absolutely incredible and inspiring at the same time and dramatic, there's a sense that we are only seeing the tip of the iceberg, and that's me probably. I'm not sure how correct my assessment is, because I've been on these trains, but at the same time I don't really have the large picture, the big picture. I was just in the middle of the whole situation. And what we've seen in Romania is a lot of people that were socially very mobile in terms of having a car, some sort of savings. They spoke English, some of them. They could move, and they moved fairly quick to the borders of the European Union. But what I've seen in eastern Ukraine on the platforms stuck at the moment is a lot of old people, a lot of people with medical problems, a lot of people that don't have enough money to reach even the Romanian or the Hungarian border. Are we seeing the tip of the iceberg, or is this the full-blown crisis? I know you don't like that word, but for the sake of it, I'm just going to use it just for this question.
Yes, no, it's a good question, Mircea. And I think you're right that the first people to leave, the first people to get out, are those perhaps middle-class people, people with resources, people with a car, people with money to buy fuel for that car, people who were watching this war approaching and realized or thought to be on the safe side, they'd better get out early. So that was definitely the first wave. But I think those people that were in that position to leave, and there, just to interrupt myself, I think it was also true of in 2015 to some extent, that the people coming then were those who had some land to sell, who had a car to sell, who could pay. In those days, they could pay the smugglers the 2,000 euros, 3,000 euros, or however much it took to get themselves out of Syria, out of Iraq, out of Afghanistan, and to pay people on the way. Of course, thank God, in this situation now, they don't need to pay anyone for their journeys, but again, it's the middle class initially trying to get out. And I fully agree that the most vulnerable people, the elderly people, are often getting left behind in this peculiar situation. So, and in terms of where this is going, I was speaking to the head of global communications of the UNHCR today. She had just been in Romania and Moldova, and she'd also been in Poland. Obviously, the UNHCR issued these figures at the beginning of the crisis that they estimated that perhaps as many as 4 million people could leave Ukraine out of the 44 million population. And I got the impression, talking to her today, obviously they've already passed the 2 million figure. So, and their initial estimates or predictions were that by July, 4 million people would have left. And yet she was saying to me, this is the fastest moving refugee crisis she's ever seen in 25 years, working for the UN Refugee Agency. And soon they may well have to, she was cautious on this point, revise that estimate upwards. Also, interestingly, looking at, it's actually available on the internet, the latest UN situation report. There it's talking about 4 million people. The UN were estimating in this early stage of the war that 250,000 people would want to be accommodated, would ask to be accommodated in Romania, a similar number, 250,000 here in Hungary, more than 1 million in Poland. And that, so the figures, that 4 million, just to break down that 4 million figure, that, very rough estimate by the UN, that basically 2.1 million people would try to seek accommodation in these 5 countries along the border of Ukraine, and another 1.9 million, pretty much half, would travel on to other European countries. And certainly here in Hungary, I'm hearing many people, probably about, I think that's probably a roughly true estimate, probably half the people I've been speaking to on the border or here at the West Railway Station Republic, because one should remember, and I think it's an important, as one tries to grapple and understand this wider refugee issue now, there were 4 million Ukrainians living in the diaspora in Western Europe before this crisis began. And so the people coming out first, to round this winding answer back to the beginning of the question, people coming out first were those who not only had money or fuel in their cars, but also had somewhere to go, friends or relatives in the diaspora. And I'm afraid that as this situation goes on, as I fear it will, for weeks or months, more and more people will be arriving who have nowhere to go. And so then they'll
Pe Nick și pe Mircea.
Nu, eu sunt aici, am crezut că eu m-am pierdut pe mine și am ieșit să mă conectez repede. O să revină Nick imediat. Dacă aveți întrebări până acum, o să le transmită lui Nick. Nu știu, ce părere aveți? Mie se pare că e unul dintre oamenii extraordinari, care foarte articulați pe tot ce înseamnă și cu păreri foarte pertinente. Sunt întrebări pe chat, sunt oameni aici care au întrebări pentru Ramona, văd că e, Alexandru, Trebuie să ies ca să intre cât mai mulți oameni la întrebări, Lavinia sau Georgia?
Nu, din câte știu, nu. Că Nick este, dacă putem să, cred că ar trebui să ridici el mâna. Nick, you should raise your hand so we can add you in the, yeah, okay.
Okay, I hope you can hear me again. Sorry, I don't know. I was talking a lot there and I don't know what point you lost me, but I am back now. I don't know if you can hear me now.
You were talking about the numbers, Nick, and that's when we briefly lost you for just 30 seconds. But I'm sure if you want to continue your idea, go ahead, please. And I'm sure that there's a lot of people here that would like to ask you some questions.
Why don't we leave the numbers now, and I'm happy to take questions. Yeah.
Let's start.
Okay, so Ramona, do you have any question you want to address?
Yeah, I do. And thank you so much. Thank you, Nick, and thank you, Mircea, and all the team who's supporting this channel for so long. It makes a lot of sense, everything you said. It's also my experience. I facilitated the entry in Romania for people who went afterwards towards Italy, Germany, Spain, and so on. I have a question to you regarding food security and the shortages of food. If among the people that you've met, there were some who were indicating, who were talking about this problem, because we're getting more and more news about food shortages in cities for a lot of people, for hundreds of thousands of inhabitants who are blocked there by the Russian army. And I work in the field of human rights for people in rural areas. And tomorrow we have a meeting with a special rapporteur for the right to food, who is now in Geneva for the Human Rights Council for the session. And yeah, I was really curious about this. If you've met people who had stories related to lack of access to food, and or they were reflecting in any way about the food security crisis that this war is already bringing, actually.
Yeah, thanks for that question, Ramona. Listening to my reports from my BBC colleagues in some cities, I know this was a big issue already in Mariupol. I know it's been an issue in several places that have been, heavily besieged by the Russian forces already. Those I've been speaking to on the borders, they had a deeply uncomfortable journeys out. They were zigzagging out of Kiev, out of Kharkiv, trying to avoid shelling and so on. Some of them were traveling on public transport. I've also spoken to people who've made it to Lviv, which has obviously turned into quite a focal point, a hub in Western Ukraine. But they said they were very well looked after there, that the actual resources in Western Ukraine, whether Transcarpathian Ukraine or in the area beyond the Carpathian Mountains, of between almost all the way to the outskirts of Kiev, in the areas the Russians have already taken, to places like Irpin and Zhytomyr to the northwest of Kiev. But so I think it's quite the early stages, and the food problem is only a problem already at this stage, as far as I'm hearing, in the besieged cities. That other places, even though there's one hears even close to the Hungarian border of supermarket shelves being emptied, but that's more the effect of sort of panic buying for the time being. So I think it's the food shortage issue. Obviously, it's already a crucial issue for those in besieged cities, also about water, electricity, internet, and so on. But it's only the beginning of that problem, which I fear will get much worse as the war progresses.
Yeah, thank you so much. That's very clear, and I believe you're very much right. And I have a second question. It's regarding the political position of Hungary, which is kind of shifting, kind of shady in the past 2 weeks of war. What do you think the upcoming elections are going to bring for Hungary and for for their position in the war? Are they going to improve their position, be more solidary with the other EU countries, or is it possible that the upcoming elections could be instrumentalized by Vladimir Putin, who likes very much to interfere, as we know from the history of the USA and so on? Or I don't know if that parallel is relevant here. Do you think that the upcoming elections are going to play a good or in what way? What are your thoughts?
Well, I'd never predict election results, but certainly one can see that this war has completely upset Viktor Orban and his government's calculations. The pro-government media here in Hungary was saying for weeks and weeks that there will be no war. And Mr. Orban was defending his policy of close friendship with Mr. Putin. He's had 11 meetings with him in the last 12 years. The most recent one, of course, at the beginning of February, which he described as a peace mission. But he said even then that, or soon after that he believes sanctions, for example, are a dead end, that it's very important for Central European countries to maintain good relations with Russia and other Eastern countries. So he has had in the last 2 weeks to really change his tune, and he's done so fairly successfully in a way. So he's now speaks much less or not at all of his friendship with Mr. Putin or Hungary's opening to the East, what he described before as the Hungarian model of being a member of NATO, a member and a loyal member of the European Union, but at the same time of maintaining good relations to the East. It sounded quite commonsensical in a way to many Hungarians before this war broke out. But now, excuse me, I should just cough a moment. Too many late nights down on the borders and on the railway station, too many early mornings on the railway stations. But now he sees the problem really for facing Viktor Orban politically now is that his own public are regaining what I guess was their old anti-Russian or anti-Soviet stance. So his own electorate is now divided between those saying that this is a shameful and terrible invasion of a neighboring country, and that Hungary is a nation which was under the Soviet boot for so many years, which experienced its own 1956 revolution against Soviet rule. And indeed, Mr. Orban himself, who came to prominence as a young firebrand politician in 1989 and 1990, saying the Russians out. The Russian troops in Hungary, then tens of thousands of them, had to leave. So he'd already performed this strange U-turn towards Russia around about 2009, 2010. And in the last 2 weeks, at the worst possible moment for him, just before, with less than 4 weeks now to go till the April the 3rd election in Hungary, once again, he's in trouble trying to sell a message. Interestingly, he is a master of politics. He's a master Viktor Orban, a master strategist. And so the message he's pumping out through all the media organs, and there are close to 500 of them loyal to him, some would say even servile to him, is that, look, we must have peace. Peace is in everyone's interests. It's the only way we can maintain cheap gas, cheap utility bills. Hungary, his government has been capping fuel prices in the fuel pumps for since October last year. So he's now presenting himself not as a friend of Vladimir Putin, but very much as a champion of peace. And part of his strategy has been to offer Budapest as a site for potential future peace talks at a high level between the Russians and Ukrainians, if such things were to happen. So he's really steering a narrow line here, but it is a big problem, this war, on the eve of an election, and no one's quite sure in Hungary, even his own supporters, how that's going to play out. He might even lose this election as a result of this war. On the other hand, if the electorate believe his message, and God knows everyone loves peace, then he might get extra support, as a strong leader in a time of war, standing up for his nation's interests. That may appeal to Hungarians equally.
Wow, so the situation is not at all black and white, and thank you so much for portraying in a such a rich way what's happening. It gives us a very clear idea. No more questions
Pleasure.
from me, and thank you.
Any other
Thank you.
questions there?
Yeah, we have also NSFW. Can you hear us?
Yeah. Hi, can you hear me? Is my mic working?
Yep,
Hello?
I can hear you.
Thank you. Thank you. Hi, Nick. First of all, thank you for your time. You've mentioned earlier that already 2.2 million refugees have fled the Ukrainian territory, whereas in the Syrian refugee crisis, Europe has actually been erecting border walls at some point in time. I wanted to ask you, how do you feel about this change in attitude for refugees? Because I've actually seen several outlets calling Europe out on this hypocrisy, as they call it, and to be perfectly honest, they do not really seem to be on the wrong side of the argument here.
Yeah, it's an interesting one, really. For me, a refugee is a refugee. As a journalist, we shouldn't get too emotional about this. Fleeing one's home, whether it's as a result of poverty, persecution, conflict, whatever, I think for me as a journalist on the front line of any refugee situation, whether it was in 2015, I think trying not to be emotional about it, but I was also trying to show empathy. When I could, I was giving water and food to people just as a human reaction to meeting people who'd walked and traveled long distances. And of course, as a journalist, our main job was to tell their story. So for me, there are many, many parallels. And of course, it is peculiar to be in a country, half of which, shall we say, those who support Mr. Orban and his version of all this, were pretty hostile to those they regarded then as economic migrants. But I think there was also 7 years ago, 8 years ago, a great ignorance, almost an enforced ignorance of who these people were and why they had left their homes. I remembered Neville Chamberlain, the British Prime Minister's comments from 19 desperately trying to appease Adolf Hitler over the Sudetenland and Nazi attempts to occupy areas of Central Europe. Then that Mr. Chamberlain, the then British Prime Minister, was talking about the Sudetenland, the Czech people, as these faraway people about whom we know nothing. And I felt back in 2015, this was really Mr. Orban and his government's message that who are all these people? Where are they coming from? They look like economic migrants to us, and therefore, at best, they're just coming to take our jobs. At worst, it's part of a sort of conspiracy to Islamize Europe. And that was a very fierce message. It was a very strong message, which was fairly popular in Hungary at that time. I remember Mr. Orban used the image of a house that he said no one, when he was criticized in Europe at the time, he said no one has the right to tell us who we let into our house. And if I'd had a chance then to speak to Mr. Orban, I've known him many years, but he wasn't so willing to give me an interview at that time. I would have said to him, yes, but if someone knocks on the door of your house, it would be polite to go down at least to the door and ask who is there, find out who these people were, or at least appear at the window and lean out and ask, who's that? What do you want? I think with the difference now today is that everyone knows who the Ukrainians are. It's pretty obvious to everyone that they're fleeing from the Russian invasion. It's much harder to portray. I think it would be impossible for any government in Europe now to portray these people as, oh, they're just economic migrants. They just want to exploit our countries or change our countries in some way. So that narrative would fall very flat. And that is a big difference between then and now. But for me as a journalist, meeting people day after day on the borders or in the railway stations, my feeling is the same. A refugee is a refugee and deserves our sympathy and, if possible, our help.
Indeed. Thank you so much, Nick, for your time. Thank you.
Thanks
Thank
for
you
the
as well.
question.
You have another one from Brooks.
Thank you very much, Nick, for taking your time tonight. Can everyone hear me? Sorry.
We can hear you. Yep.
Okay, perfect. So, I'm really just touching a bit upon the previous question. So, years ago, when Europe was facing unprecedented flows of refugees, the general sentiment back then was quite confusing, called inadequate. Today, a paradigm shift purely on the basis of cultural closeness, or to better describe it, cultural affinity.
Yeah, it's an interesting one. I think too much is made about cultural differences in this world, in this sort of very globalized world. You know, I remember, just to give a foolish example, with so much talk of terrorism 7 years ago, people, talking about a clash of civilizations and these people from other cultures coming to Europe. Not enough was made, I felt, 7 years ago of the fact, for example, that these conservative parties like the Fidesz party, the Fidesz government of Viktor Orban here in Hungary, they have a very strong pro-family policy. They're wary of, for example, alternative forms of marriages or relationships. A lot of the people coming then had large families, many children, quite socially conservative, and in fact they should have had a great cultural affinity with the people that were most vehemently saying they should not be allowed into Europe, the more conservative minded people of Bavaria, of Hungary, of other parts of Germany or France, who were afraid of cultural differences, of a more diversified society. Equally now in this crisis, here we are in 2022. I was in a taxi the other morning, and the taxi driver was saying to me, wait a minute, everyone says these are sort of white Christians, Ukrainians coming across the border, deserving our help. Even our government says that this time. But if I go down to the railway station, I see lots of dark faces. This was because just in the University of Vinica, which I know Mircea visited because I spoke to him there the other day, in central Ukraine, or rather south of the capital Kiev, there were 22,000 medical students there, foreign medical students, many of them from sub-Saharan Africa. So I met at the railway stations there, lots of students from Chad, from Cameroon, from Nigeria, quite well dressed, pretty middle class. Someone was paying for their education, for their university places in Ukraine. It was probably a bit cheaper than it would be in London or in or in Paris or something, or in Milan. But still, so there was a kind of disconnect there. That, wait a minute. Also, I was watching the faces of the policemen around the West Station. These were the same policemen, or their younger brothers, who 7 years ago, or younger sisters for that matter, were trying to keep the migrants out of railway stations. All around them were all these students from Africa, from the Middle East, a huge number of people of ethnic Roma, Gypsy people who'd come across the border. And so there's much less sort of ethnic and cultural homogeneity than one would be led to believe among the new arrivals, shall we say, than one would read in pro-government media here. Just as 7 years ago, there was sort of less clash of civilizations. Actually, these were, as ever, people on the road, and quite often quite middle class, quite conservative people who'd fled their countries, admittedly from somewhat different cultures. But in this globalized world, I think these differences are often overplayed. I could give one other example. I covered the riots in Paris, in the suburbs of Paris, way back, I think it was 2004 or 2005. And on that occasion, I remember standing outside a courtroom where some of the teenagers, often as young as 14 or 15, who were accused of setting fire to cars there. But it was quite a mixture of white, French teenagers, quite a lot of North African, from kids from Algeria originally, so very much new immigrants into France, also from Mali, from Senegal, from West Africa, and so on. And I once asked the older brothers waiting outside the courtroom where their younger brothers were on trial in the courts. I said to them, I didn't think you guys get on too well. You know, there are a lot of ethnic tensions especially among the poor in France. And they were saying, well, they were shifting from foot to foot and saying, well, that's true. But I'll tell you, 15-year-olds today, the 14-year-olds today, they don't care about ethnic difference. That's not what they look for in all of this. That was sort of positive sense of France as a multicultural society. And I always felt that the journalists, or many journalists, were making too much of the ethnic differences and the cultural differences. And in fact, what those riots were about in France all those years ago was actually about social differences. It was a deprivation. It was the poor against the rich rather than black against white.
Yes, indeed. This is a topic that will always be grey between social and cultural. It's never black or white. One last question from my side. I'm witnessing today, so I'm based in the Netherlands, and what I'm witnessing is a deep anti-Russian sentiment that triggers, or let's say targets, everyone, irrespective of the fact that they've been living in this country for 20 years. They are facing quite a harsh reality that everyone just hates Russia and we're part of the cancel culture. How do you think, or better said, do you think that traditional media does justice in creating this barrier of let's stop the hatred against Russians as people, let's stop, or let's not cancel Dostoevsky, as I was reading in an article the other week, but let's focus on sanctions and the whole agenda on the economic side? Do you think that there's this being done on this front?
No, I don't. And I think you've raised a hugely important point, that there's a kind of knee-jerk reaction that you're witnessing there. But I think it's very easy for the media, whether mainstream media or less mainstream media, social media, in this situation, there is a kind of demonization of Russia and all things Russian, which I think is very dangerous, because it's, if one looks politically at all of this, Boris Johnson and his government in my country, in Britain, was in deep trouble over Partygate before all of this happened. Justin Trudeau in Canada, the Prime Minister of Canada, was in huge trouble there because of the Ottawa, the truckers and the movement against the mandates there. And somehow this crisis came to their rescue. Those are just kind of sidelines. But to come back to your question here, and I've seen this before in the Balkan Wars, for example, Serbs were demonized then, not just Slobodan Milosevic or Radovan Karadzic or Ratko Mladic, the sort of military and political leaders that were doing terrible things. They were, it's one thing to demonize Vladimir Putin or Slobodan Milosevic, to demonize demons on the one hand, but to blame a whole people, the Russians, especially at a time when many brave young Russians are going out onto the streets to risk arrest or worse, by standing up against the regime, standing in solidarity with the people of Ukraine. So I think it is very important to go against this sort of demonization of all things Russian. On the other hand, as one sees these, McDonald's or Starbucks or Kentucky Fried Chicken or Exxon Mobil or Shell or all the big companies, Tommy Hilfiger, I don't know who else, does this sort of endless list now of countries stepping out of Russia or suspending their operations there. I think to bring it home to Russians, just how isolated their country is in the world, and to bring it home to ordinary people, some of whom, of course, aren't getting the information that they need could be useful. On the other hand, if one's demonizing everything Russian, if one's demonizing another side, one's kind of whitewashing oneself as well. And let's face it, there is plenty of room, and there should be plenty of room for self-criticism in Europe, in the Western world. I'm very uncomfortable when I see these kind of headlines saying things like, this is a battle of the free world against the wicked Russians. There's lots of, things wrong with our own societies, and we shouldn't demonize the Russians any more than we should try and whitewash all the problems and issues and wickednesses in our own society.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Nick, from my side. And again, thank you very much for joining tonight.
Thanks for your very good questions.
Pleasure talking to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nick. We don't have a live question, but if you want to take a written one, we have a question in the chat.
Sure. Yeah, I've got 15% on my phone, but I think it'll hold up for a bit longer.
Okay.
So yeah, if there's but I'm not sure I can see maybe you could read out for me the question. Yeah.
Sure. So there's one question coming in from Bogdana. What can you tell us about Hungary's political stance regarding the invasion? Evaluate Hungary's controversial relationship with Russia, and what would the determining factors be? Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, we've touched on this before, but and Mr. Orban has been forced to sort of change his tune very much. I think he has said all along that since the war started that Hungary respects the territorial integrity and sovereignty of Ukraine. And he said even before the war started that it's very important from a Hungarian perspective that Ukraine exists as a buffer zone between Hungary, of course, and of other countries, and Russia. But as we see the sort of spread of the red patches on the map of Russian forces taking control of that wide strip of land along the northern border, the eastern border, and the southern border on the Black Sea, as the front, as it were, gets closer to Hungary, we've seen more changes politically. Until now, Mr. Orban, or I think until Monday of this week, Mr. Orban had been saying Hungary would not accept NATO and did not want NATO troops, US troops or whoever on its territory, and certainly wouldn't be involved in any weapons movement, certainly not towards Ukraine, but even say from Slovakia to Romania. He's changed his tune very much. He's actually performed a big U-turn on that, namely that a new decree was passed by the government a couple of days ago saying that from now on NATO forces can be stationed on Hungarian territory. NATO flights are allowed across Hungarian airspace. There were photographs taken a couple of days ago, or just as that regulation came into force, of American B-52 planes in the airspace above Hungary. Hungary is now also willing to allow weapons to flow across its territory, say from Slovakia to Romania or the other way in reverse, though I think Mr. Orban stressing that these should be not close to the border zone, but in west of Hungary, west of the River Danube. So there is a big change. And I think Mr. Orban also was in London yesterday with other leaders of the Visegrad 4 countries for a meeting with within the Visegrad 4, but also for talks with Boris Johnson. So there, I think there is a change in Mr. Orban's position, because he's realized in a sense that he's losing quite fast Ukraine as a buffer zone. And if you lose Ukraine as a buffer zone, just looking at the map, you become the buffer zone, which, if one thinks back to Vladimir Putin's message to NATO and the US, the Western Alliance, last December, he was very much saying exactly that he wants the creation of a buffer zone again. Not only is his war aim, as it's become, to get Ukraine back into the Russian sphere of influence very firmly, but it's also to turn countries like Romania, Hungary, Slovakia, the Czech Republic, and the Baltic states into his own buffer zone which he can influence, and certainly wouldn't in future be strong or active members of NATO. So I think all these things are affecting Mr. Orban's politics and policies, especially, as we've mentioned already, in this very important pre-election period. And also another problem for him, a growing problem for him, is over prices, because part of his huge popularity in Hungary in the past has been simply an economic one, not so much an ideological or a national one. He declared a cap on utility prices, on gas and heating prices, way back in 2013, and he's kept that, so that he's actually, him staying in power means to many ordinary, relatively poor Hungarians cheap utility bills. And when you get your utility bill, it says on it how much he's forced the electricity and gas companies to put on each bill that arrives for you to pay through your letterbox each week or each month, how much the government measures have saved you that month. So with the pressures now on oil and gas transport from Russia to Central Europe and wider Europe, the price is already soaring in the petrol pumps, for example. The price of gas will go even higher. And Mr. Orban, whether he wins this election, even if he wins this election, he won't be able to cap those prices any longer. So he can no longer, he's losing one of his main election slogans, cheap gas from Russia.
Oh, thank you so much for this one, Nick. Not sure if your phone can face another question. We have someone on the stage right now. Want to ask you a question?
Absolutely, yeah.
Okay. Tarbos, please.
Hello, Nick. Talking about the economic sanctions that were mentioned earlier, my question about them is, does isolating Russia from the Western world economically, necessary as it is right now, does it bear the risk of further radicalizing the common Russians and maybe rising their pro-war sentiment?
It's a good question. It's a very difficult one to answer. I can only relate to a personal experience of this myself, which was in the former Yugoslavia, in Serbia. Obviously, sanctions were imposed on Serbia during the Kosovo War in 98-99. And there, it seems, in these situations, it seems to go both ways. You have a lot of anger generated among ordinary people that don't blame us for our government. We didn't vote for them, or we voted for them, who cares? But why punish us all? Just punish, why don't you, if you've got to, assassinate our leader or something, but don't punish us ordinary people, don't prevent us from traveling to Western Europe, don't do this. But also, it does have an effect of radicalizing opposition to the regime of the day. The fall of Slobodan Milosevic in 2000 is unimaginable if he hadn't lost Kosovo in 1999 in the wake of the airstrikes and the Western world of NATO, which I've witnessed myself from within Yugoslavia, and it was pretty strange to be in Belgrade at that time, being bombed, as it were, by one's own air force, and to be declared an enemy journalist by the then Serbian government. But certainly, because he, and I'm talking about Slobodan Milosevic now, the Serbian president, he lost that war in a sense. He was forced to do a deal with Kosovo, with the West, and in the end, Serbia lost what many ordinary Serbs, whatever their political stance, regard as the cradle of their own country, of their own civilization, Kosovo, as a result of that, because sorry, I hope I'm still connected.
Yes,
I am still connected. Sorry, I managed to fend off that call for now. So then Mr. Milosevic's loss of Kosovo was crucial to what became a radicalization against him of his own society, a student organization called Otpor, which means resistance or protest, grew, first of all, with graffiti of a fist just sprayed onto walls and bridges, and then it grew into a popular movement which toppled the Milosevic regime only a year or so after the loss of Kosovo. So these things do go both ways, and it would be, seeing these protests in Russia today and the brutal repression of those protests, I think it's, clearly the strain within Russia of this situation, this information war going on, these astonishing array of kind of ways that are being found internationally to exclude Russia and therefore, sadly, Russians from the kind of, the bloodstream of the world today. Who knows how that will end or when it might end.
I understand.
Nick,
Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Nick. I know you have to go your battery, and you've gave us more than what we agreed in terms of time, and I'm very grateful to you, and I'm sure everyone else here is for your time and your input, your feedback and your stories. And you're more than welcome to come back to this platform anytime you feel the need to share some of your reporting on the ground. I'll be sure to nag you from time to time to come back and do a live session. If there are any more questions, I'll try to answer them myself or pass them along to Nick when I see him, and I'm sure we'll see each other on the ground in or around Ukraine in the near future. Thank you, Nick. Thank you for joining us. Have a good night.
Thank you.
And stay safe.
Thanks, Mircea, and you stay safe too. Thanks very much for inviting me to take part in this conversation this evening. Thank you all for your questions, and I wish you all the best, and stay safe, Mircea, and all of you covering this issue or in your lives, wherever you are. All right. Thanks very much. Bye, everybody.
Thank you so much, Nick. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Nick Thorpe, if you want, we can continue in English, because my understanding is there are some English speakers on the channel. So for the sake of it tonight, we might as well just keep going. If you have any other questions or debates or ideas you want to share, please feel free to do so. I'm driving, so I have all the time in the world. And we can keep this session for another half an hour, 45 minutes open.
Mircea, there are some questions in the chat. I believe one was for Nick. Not sure if you want me to read those or.
We might as well, and I'll try. Obviously, they're for Nick, so if they're like relating to his personal experiences, I'm not gonna be able to answer. But if they're like general questions about the situation in Ukraine, I can take a shot at it.
Okay. Yeah, so there's one question from Gafrin, and he's asking, based on his knowledge, so on Nick's knowledge, is Hungary treating the Ukrainian refugees differently from how the Muslim migrants were treated a few years ago? Are there any lessons learned from the past that are now applied to this situation?
Oh, that's a difficult question for me to answer. That was a very specific question for Nick. Obviously, he lives in Hungary. I wouldn't be able to tell you more than just to speculate. I can relate to my own experience as a reporter in Romania in terms of public opinion. If in 2015 the polls showed that 60% of Romanians said no to the refugee crisis and no to welcoming a refugee in Romania, now we have I think it was close to 65-63%. Read the poll the other day saying yes to a Ukrainian refugee. So there was a shift in the public opinion perception of what a refugee wants and needs. I was pretty blunt in terms of how I called it, and we discussed this on Discord. I called it a bit of a hypocrisy, but there were other people, including Ramona, who spoke earlier and asked the questions, and many other people who said, "Well, you shouldn't really look at it just from this perspective." And it made me reflect on my own assessments. And with that being said, I think we are learning a lot throughout the process of welcoming or in getting in touch or um, having contact with people in need, with people in despair. So maybe that changed. We obviously have some cultural similarities and the geographical proximity that does play a role. We can't really ignore that. But like Nick said, a refugee is a refugee. So in terms of Romania's policy, I haven't really seen the difference. I mean, Simina Guga was here on the platform the other night, and she didn't say anything about a legal or a political statement different from other refugee waves compared to this one. I think we've seen more of a social solidarity more than anything else. The authorities claim they've prepared for this, but we see more. Well, at least what I've seen passing through Siret and watching the news while I was home in Romania, I've seen more NGOs and volunteer presence at the borders of Romania. At least Romania, I can't really speak for Hungary, but at least for Romania, we've seen more of a civil society coming together than the authorities. That's not to say that the Romanian authorities are not there. They are. I've seen plenty of them, but for some reason they're not as visible or they're not as effective, which arguably it's quite understandable at this point because what we have is mostly people transiting Romania. So we will need to, or we will see probably Romanian institutions responding to this situation when people will settle here, and that's where the key issue will play. When people will need social services such as hospitals, education for children, and access to all sorts of social facilities, including housing, long-term housing, and so on. So I wouldn't really say that, at least in Romania's case, we've seen a huge difference or even a significant difference in approach, but we definitely seen a social solidarity, an increased social solidarity on behalf of Romanians. You're just your Romanian average Romanian people responding to this crisis. And I'm actually saying this as I am driving a motorhome loaded, literally loaded with medical aids and food and medicine for people in Ukraine. Because like I said in the beginning of this chat, since I'm driving there, I posted an ad on Facebook saying, look, I have an empty van. If anyone has anything to send, I will happily take it to Ukraine. And I have from toys, just a couple bags with toys, to sleeping bags, to very crucial first aid kits, to even food and basic hygiene products. And I hope that answers the question, at least partially. Now, if not, Hungary's way gives us some sort of perspective from from a Romanian journalist.
Yeah, I believe it does. Thank you so much, Mircea. And we have Ramona on the stage if you want to ask a question.
Yeah, sorry for sorry for jumping again. I'm taking advantage of Mircea. I'm wondering. I have two questions. The first one is about this news. Remember when Ursula came to Romania? She was talking about setting up here a humanitarian hub, and she was talking about a ginormous budget for that. And I was wondering if you know anything, if the Romanian government already started setting the infrastructure for such a thing, how it would look like. And this is the first question. And the second is about, I'm curious if you know already, and I'm even more curious in the next few days after you're going to be back in Ukraine and you'll know more. How many people are able to enter, how many organizations, and who are the actors who are able now to enter in Ukraine to deliver humanitarian aid, food, medical supplies and things like that? I mean, is it possible also for smaller groups to do it? Is it safe, or considering the situation, it's more something that is handled by big institutional organization, big organizations or governments?
Right. So let me actually answer the second question before I answer the first one in terms of how Romania prepares, because I don't really have a lot of information, but I could tell you from my previous experiences what I think might happen in terms of those budgets, how they're gonna be spent, and who will actually spend them. In terms of aid, because I've personally taken some interest in delivering some. I've um, I've looked into it and I've spoken with a number of people who either crossed the border into Ukraine in the last 72 hours or so, or they're on their way to cross, or they're on their way back. You have all sorts of actors on the ground. You have small NGOs, but you also have your average volunteer who just loaded a van and wants to drive into Ukraine and send some help, as well as the big trucks, the big NGOs, the big organizations such as the Red Cross, UNICEF, and everyone else you can think of is there on the ground, more or less with some sort of presence. Now, in terms of safety, I wouldn't really advise personally for small NGOs or for small people to deliver aid into Ukraine, deep into these cities. But I think what small NGOs or individuals can do is either link up with some sort of bigger NGOs even in Romania or Moldova, or if they wish to deliver the aid themselves, kind of like go in on a limited basis, geographically speaking. For instance, if people have a van, they can drive to Chernobyl, which is fairly safe at the moment, and deliver their aid to the communities and villages there, if they want to do that themselves, obviously. And I think it's a good idea because there's pluses and minuses when it comes to big NGOs. While they might be able to have a deeper reach into Ukraine, sometimes some areas remain uncovered just because they're in their blind spot for whatever reason. So that's why it's good to have a mix of individuals on the ground and then all kinds of organizations that are able to help, because they can work on different levels of humanitarian aid. So I hope we will see that. I wouldn't like, if I was a small NGO or just a guy, raising some help and having to deliver some humanitarian aid. I wouldn't go as far as Odessa, but I would definitely try to go to the border of Romania, perhaps Poland or Hungary, and drive into Ukraine, just there into the closest half big town, whatever. Link up with maybe an NGO or just spend the time there, a day or two, delivering the aid to people that obviously need it on the ground. And I hope that answers your second question. In terms of who's going to spend this budget and how it's going to be spent, I think we're going to see a mix of it being absorbed by the Romanian state, by ISU and all the first emergency responders, with some sort of presence on the ground to offer medical assistance and emergency shelter. But I think what the European Union is looking into is to actually work with NGOs such as UNHCR, or even small NGOs that are on the ground at the moment working, such as Logs in Timișoara, which is an NGO that I honestly recommend you guys look into and see what they're doing. And if you're thinking to donate, that's my personal choice when it comes to donating to refugees and migrants, and I've tried to help them as much as I could in the past. And we're gonna basically see an absorption of funds, in my opinion, by these NGOs, whether it's UNHCR or Save the Children, any other big organization that might actually then engage with smaller NGOs to give them some of that budget to do whatever, to keep doing what they're doing at the moment, or change focus on whatever is going to be needed. So I don't think we're going to see that money being absorbed mostly by Romanian state as it will be by the civil society. And that was the case in the past. I think that's going to be the case with this situation.
Wow. Yeah. So much, Mircea. Yeah, it's true, and I recognize what you're saying also from my experience. It's possible to have a lot of money just given to bureaucracy and not really to the victims of the war.
Well, it's always a tricky thing, and I've contemplated this idea myself and observed. I think at the moment UNHCR needs a big reform, if you ask me. But at the same time, I have to acknowledge that I've seen them at work in places like Jordan, in places like Turkey, where it's almost impossible to deal with the influx of people and their needs. Just if you're a small or medium-sized NGO, sometimes you need these huge international operations, logistically at least, to set up these camps that turn into cities. It's not great, obviously. It's not the best thing that can happen, but people do need it. If we're gonna have millions, as the estimates show that we will, you do need the proper logistics to deal with that. And no small or medium-sized NGO can cope with that influx, no matter how good intended they are. You do need that sort of international solidarity that big NGOs, are able to bring together. But at the same time, it's quite frustrating to see that a lot of the money is being spent on staff expenses and offices and bureaucracy. It's just, there's definitely a room for improvement and a need for immediate reform.
Actually, the UN went through a reform which concluded in 2018. They had a lot of institutions, a lot of not it's improper to say institutions. They had a lot of spaces, like the human rights were not really communicating with food security, institutions, whatever. There was no coordination between the different bodies of the UN, and supposedly they made them work better. At least I know that in Ukraine there is a very good communication between the National Office for FAO, the Food and Agriculture Organization of the UN, and the OHCHR, the Office of High Commissioner for Human Rights National Office. And I spoke this morning with the regional office of FAO based in Budapest, and they were saying that regarding Ukraine, they just went to a country mission, and they set up already quite quickly a chain of command, responsible as a task force, but they're waiting for the intervention of their field is not humanitarian aid. This is the field of other UN bodies, and they were, but they are starting to work already on the upcoming food crisis, which is, I saw that Zelensky already reported today a child who died of dehydration. And I'm sure tons of more cases like this people affected by hunger, extreme hunger, are going to come up in the next days. And who knows how long, for how long. But supposedly they went for reform, but I'm sure, and I agree with what you say about more reform in the light also of COVID, who learned us, taught us some more lessons, and not to mention this war, who is going to teach us some more, some more hard lessons.
Well, I completely agree with you. In terms of food security. I think this is going to be a huge issue in the upcoming month. It is already a big problem, and I've experienced it myself, more or less traveling and getting out of cities as such as Mariupol or Kiev, and fuel shortages and anything related to people's security in terms of goods and in medical supplies, you name it. It's happening, and I've seen it, and it's going to get worse most likely as we do not see a big change in terms of de-escalation or any humanitarian functional working humanitarian corridors that where people can get out and supplies, food can get in. It's almost impossible. I know for sure that I've been contacted by people at the border, at the Ukrainian-Moldovan border, families of truck drivers who are stuck at the border at the moment, trying to either get in or get out of Ukraine with food supplies, and they're just experiencing huge queues, which obviously there's a reason for that. There's a humanitarian crisis happening, but at the same time, it's quite paradox. It's quite a paradox. People are getting out where they can be fed, while the much needed food supplies are not going in to those who need it. And this is just part of the food chain, as you better know than I do. It's the local food chain that is being halted at the moment by the war in terms of moving goods and agricultural products from one city to another. That's at the moment, as it looks, if not completely stopped, just definitely decimated.
Yeah, actually, something that I learned today was that the tractors and all these big mechanization tools that are normally used in farming, they have been taken by the government to be at the disposal of the army, and they're looking at the perspective of going back to an agriculture with horses and hoes, just like Romanians were doing back in the 90s. Well, my family also does it nowadays, but nevertheless, like they don't have means of production anymore, and they can't produce themselves, or they can at a smaller scale and in areas where the conflict didn't reach. But at the moment, it's not clear how far the conflict will go, and it's still like this changing season of winter towards spring. So nobody started farming. Nobody's thinking about it now.
Yeah. I mean, that's obviously. I understand why. What I was curious, and I wanted to ask you, Ramona, is there a phenomenon of land grab? And I'll briefly explain, or you might as well while you're here. Is there in Ukraine a land grabbing phenomenon? Did oligarchs moved into buying land? How does the agricultural landscape in terms of ownership looks like, and or look
Yeah.
like before?
Well, many countries in Eastern Europe after the fall of communism went through different forms of agrarian reforms. Probably the most successful one, even though it wasn't perfect, it's the one that happened in Romania. In Romania, after the land reform was so successful, it gave so much land back to the people that 16% of the people from the cities moved back to the countryside, 60% of the population. On the other side, we have the agrarian reform of countries like Ukraine, who pretended to do an agrarian reform, but actually maintained the status quo, maintained the majority of the land in the state's property and administration, and promised that one day there's going to be land liberalization, and there's going to be land for all, and so on. Before the Maidan revolution, there was a deal that was just about to be closed by Yanukovych, or Yanukovych is the guy in exile in Belarus, right?
Yes.
Yeah, so he was about to sell something like 3 million hectares of land to China. Of course, this deal was intermediated by Russia. But Maidan happened, and that deal was never concluded. And the kind of land grabbing that is happening in Ukraine is at such a scale. And I mean, imagine that the land grabbing was about to be done by another country, not a pension fund or a corporation or whatever, like straight up China. You should know that Ukraine it's a incredible agriculture country. So if Ukraine joins the EU, it's going to compete straight up with Germany and France. It has 40 million hectares of arable land, the best land in the world. It's black Chernozem, and it's called the black gold because everybody wants it. Everybody's gonna chase this land. There is land grabbing happening in the form of pocket contracts. So people kind of know what land they are supposed to receive in case there's a land redistribution, a land distribution, and they're closing deals with contracts without a date on them. And they already got the money, and there's a lot of deals done like that, a lot of land that was bought like that, consolidated by different large companies from Western Europe mostly. But it's like a black market of land grabbing done in a invisible black market. In 2019, in December 2019, there was a big attempt from Zelensky and his new government to liberalize the agricultural land. We in the organization that I work with, we negotiated in the UN a declaration, a United Nations declaration for peasant rights, and we convinced Ukraine to vote in favor of it in the Human Rights Council and so on. And they supposedly were big supporters of the rights of peasants and so on. But this new president, and this happened under Poroshenko, not with this new president. When Zelensky came in with his liberal views, he started to think about land liberalization, and he sold it to the Ukrainians like, now you're going to have the right to land. And people knew that he was planning a large-scale liberalization, and they knew that the people with the most money, with the biggest amount of money, are going to get the land, and local communities are going to be forgotten. They're going to become ghettos, rural ghettos, by land worked by corporations and agro holdings, as they say. So it didn't happen. They had a protest in Kiev. A peasant died actually at the protest. He was beaten by the police so hard he died in the hospital. And in 2020, the opportunity came again when they imposed the lockdown. But what happened was that the IMF blackmailed the government. Ukraine didn't have enough resources to respond to the COVID crisis, and they went to look for money for a loan to IMF. And IMF always comes with conditions of to privatize different resources or different services or factories or whatever, and they imposed to Ukraine to liberalize 20 million hectares of arable land in order to receive this money support fund for the health system, and they did it. There were protests again, but they were under big restrictions. And so it goes. And now, it's very difficult to follow the what's happening with this. They're not in the process of implementing now that law that they passed in early 2020. So yeah, we're trying to follow this with our partners from Ukraine, and it's one of the most interesting stories of land grabbing in Europe, I would say. And yeah, with all of these horror stories, maybe in the world. I'm done.
Thank you, Ramona. Mircea, I don't know if you can still hear us. We cannot hear you. No, still okay.
In any case, sorry to be so long.
Oh, no. Can you hear me now? Thank you for that.
Yes, we can.
to say that it was really good explanation, and for me personally, it's a good angle to look at things in this upcoming trip. And Ramona, I'll definitely get back to you whether it's going to be here or via private message. If not, if actually better said, when I'll have the opportunity to document food security on the ground with some sort of report.
Well, I'll keep you in the loop with what we're doing then, because we're
Yeah,
trying to organize on this. And
okay.
take your time anyway.
All right, thank you.
Thank
Any
you.
other questions or topics anyone here wants to discuss before we conclude this live session?
Not sure, Mircea, if you want to take another question from the chat.
Yeah, let's try.
Okay, so there was another one from Gofren. Given that the majority of the refugees are women, children, and elderly people, what do you think are the main destinations of these waves? Markets looking to absorb workforce were interesting for other migrations, but this might not be the case now, with families living in hurry without a thought-out plan. What are the options for people now besides friends in diaspora?
So what we see now in terms of the gender representation of Ukrainians fleeing conflict is not necessarily it's not necessarily a reflection of a reality of who wants to leave. Obviously, the men cannot leave. With very few exceptions, we rarely see any men. It's going to be hard for women with children to travel abroad and work, which actually might, in a way, um, have a positive impact on the country in the sense that, and this is something I've asked those people fleeing Ukraine when I've met them, at least some of them, do you intend to come back? And a lot of them did say yes because it's a social reality. They had 2 or 3 kids or some sort of a husband behind, boyfriend, partner, and they said yes. My house is in Ukraine, my husband is here, my brother, my father, and they, at least to me, it seems that they regard this as a temporary solution, and it's also the way the European Union looks at this situation. They've activated an emergency plan that specifically gives a legal fast pathway to temporary asylum, at least for 1 year, because Europe does not want to encourage not necessarily a settlement, but some sort of uh, 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 I'm trying to find the proper word, and some sort of presence, permanent presence of refugees. Does not want to encourage that. Does not want to, not necessarily that they don't want to receive them, but they don't want this to become a permanent issue. People living apart from their loved ones, from their countries, from their communities, long term. So, with that being said, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to be a reality. In my experience, I've met people, both women and men, but in this case, we're talking about women and children. If the conflict will last years, and there are signs that it might, if the conflict will last for years, you will have an entire generation of children that will grow up in outside Ukraine, and it will be very difficult for those families, even single families, if they're not going to be joined by the fathers, husbands slash husbands. It's going to be difficult for those families, for those children, to want to come back. So it's an open question, I guess. At the moment, yes, it's going to be difficult for them to work. to do anything else besides taking care of their children. But as the conflict persists, we risk on seeing these people permanently settling. And when I say risk, I don't mean security risk. You know what I mean. Risk for them, for the social fabric of the Ukrainian society to fall apart.
Very interesting.
Hello.
Thank you so much. Yeah, thank you so much, Mircea, for your
So,
answer.
we still have another 5 or 10 minutes, so if there's one or two more questions, we can quickly go through that. If there's anyone else that wants to share a thought or their opinion on today's event or events in Ukraine, I guess, please feel free to do so.
Yeah, so anyone in the audience, just raise your hand if you want to ask a question or ask about something. We don't have anyone, so not sure if you want to pick up. Have another question in the chat.
I think we can leave it at this. My battery is dying as well.
Okay.
I can charge my phone, and it's getting a bit too dark and a bit too late to be driving and paying attention as I should be paying attention to just the road, to both Discord and the road. So thank you so much for this. Thank you for moderating. Thank you for listening. I think it was by far one of the best sessions we have on Discord, and I'm really excited that we get the chance to listen to people like Nick, like Ramona, like Catalina, and other guests. I'll try as best as I can to have at least a couple times a week someone that can share an expert and advised opinion on the situation in Ukraine, whether that's a journalist, that's a human rights specialist, a lawyer, I don't know, even people from the ground. I'm working hard at the moment to get someone from Ukraine to join us on the platform and to share their experience from the cities that are at the moment being besieged. I think it's very relevant to have their opinion here and to listen to them straight from the ground and understand what their needs, their hopes, and their fears are. It will definitely help them and help us. So thank you again. Have a good night.
Thank you so much, Mircea. We're
Please
looking
don't
forward.
forget. You know, I'm finishing this like a vlogger. Please don't forget to share and subscribe to the new social media pages.
They are on the.
We have a
Yeah.
yeah.
Posted
Go
the
ahead.
links. Instagram,
Please do post the
Facebook,
link.
and YouTube.
Yeah, and hit the subscribe button, like, share, follow, whatever you wish to do. Thank you. Have a good night.
Thank you so much, Mircea. Have a nice
Stay safe.
evening.
Stay safe.
Everyone as well.